first of all, actually, if you're going to get it straight, my Uncle John and Mrs. Hoffmeister, which is Dad's sister.
Well, it doesn't matter. We are.
Okay, and Mrs. Tony Dingman. Those three came over here before grandfather came. Well, then my grandfather came, and with the rest of the family, with my dad and Uncle Bill and Aunt Gazella and Aunt Wilhelmine and Uncle Ferdinand. Yeah, that's about the works. Yeah. They landed in Winnipeg. Now they're in 1903 or 4. So 1903. Or I think Uncle John was here a year before, and then they were in Winnipeg until about 1906.
Welcome back. At the dawn of the 20th century, Winnipeg's population exploded. Since the mid-1800s, it had been a destination for settlers arriving on foot and by Red River carts, growing in size from 241 residents in 1871 to 8,000 just 10 years later. And as impressive as those numbers surely are, they were just the beginning. In 1881, the Canadian Pacific Railroad arrived and the ox carts were gone. Settlers poured in, and by 1903, the Chicago of the North, as some called it, was swarming with 67,000 people, most pouring in from the old Habsburg Empire. The influx was due to an immigration policy initiated by Prime Minister Wilfrid Laurier and executed by his minister, Clifford Sifton. Although Middle Europeans were the government's third preferred choice for immigrants, after the British Isles and Western Europe, Sifton sought these stalwart peasants in sheepskin coats, as he called them, to do the hard work of turning the western plains into productive farms. From 1891 to 1921, more than 3 million continental Europeans answered his call, mostly Bohemian Germans, Austrians, Hungarians, Poles, and Ukrainians. And among these, eventually, 3 of my great-grandparents and all 4 of my grandparents. In 1903, Ferdinand Lang and Catherine Hartle's children, John and Anastasia, and their spouses, Elizabeth Ullman and Anton Degelman, were among the first to arrive at the bustling CPR station in Winnipeg. No doubt the train ride from Halifax to Winnipeg had taught most newcomers an important lesson about Canada. It is big. Then and now, after Russia, it remains the second largest country on Earth. The distances can be daunting to Europeans who might travel through 2 or 3 countries in one day. So most were not prepared for the long train ride ahead. The CPR colonist trains from Halifax to Winnipeg traveled 3,450 kilometers. In Europe, that would be like traveling from Lviv, Ukraine to Portugal, through a half-dozen countries en route. In Canada, not only did they not pass through another country, but when they arrived in Winnipeg, the end of Canada still lay another 2,500 kilometers farther west. Many recall elders asking, "Does this country never end?" When Ferdinand's contingent arrived in 1904, John and Elizabeth were already living in their own as yet unfinished house at 511 Mountain, and had bought a second lot next door. And that was a big deal in the foreign quarter of Winnipeg, where housing was so scarce that on one street 837 people lived in just 41 houses, more than 20 per house, and these were small houses by today's standards. And with residents living cheek by jowl, conditions were perfect for increasing the already significant risk of contagious diseases. Although older Winnipeg had more amenities, all residents drank untreated water, and it was estimated that 30% of the milk from dairy farms was contaminated with tuberculosis. Conditions were even worse in the foreign quarter, where outhouses leached into alleys, contributing to outbreaks of typhoid fever, killing 500 people each year, which was a higher death rate than any other city in North America at the time. The infant mortality rate was a horrifying 25%. 1 in 4 babies did not survive. Our ancestors fared better than most, with just 1 known fatality from typhus. In this otherwise risky environment, the economic conditions created by an exploding population were ideal for our clan of carpenters, who immediately set about building houses, starting with their own. Having cash was a bonus, and Ferdinand at least was flush. When 511 was finished, he bought more lots for $100 or less each, all in the neighborhood. Until 513 was completed, the whole gang lived in 511. In what is among the most valued photographs in our family's history, we see them assembled in front of it in 1905. You can see that only scattered buildings and bare prairie lie beyond the house on both sides, where today you'd be in the middle of the city. Let's get a closer look at this cast of characters. Left to right, a very rare photo of my great-uncle Joseph Lang, my grandfather Francis' younger brother. 4 years after this photo was taken, and married with 2 children, he was that sole family victim of typhus I alluded to earlier. To his right, these 4 men are likely boarders. Then we see the first photo ever of my mother's notorious parents as a couple, Agatha Rice and her new husband Franz Lang, newly arrived from New York. He'd landed there a few months earlier, and according to my mother, he was not keen to leave the Big Apple. That changed when he received a strongly worded letter from his brothers to come immediately and marry a desperate Agatha, who had just arrived from Europe with their 4-year-old son Wenzel in tow. Their intriguing story will be told in a future episode. Here is Max Lang's oldest sister, Mariana, with her husband Wenzel Hofmeister and one of their children. This is Anastasia Degelman with baby. And here's Ferdinand and Katharina, likely young Wilhelmina at her feet. And finally, Mary, or Marie, and Lawrence Lang, Franz's brother, with baby Helen. This young lad is likely Ferdinand and Catherine's youngest son, Ferdinand Jr., also known as Fertile. Most of these people, plus several others not shown, lived in this house. With 511 bursting at the seams, Ferdinand and his sons likely worked with Wenzel Hofmeister and Anton Degelman to build Ferdinand's house at 513 Mountain, as well as 507 Mountain for Anton and Anastasia, and 491 Mountain for Ferdinand's cousin Lawrence and his brothers Joseph and Franz. All but one of these houses is lived in today. Contrary to its name, Mountain Avenue is as flat as a pizza, and in 1904 there was nothing to stop the Red River when it overflowed its banks and flooded the foreign quarter. This was a regular event for the indigenous people who had lived here for millennia, but it was an unwelcome surprise to the settlers. Ancestral lore says some folks paddled canoes up and down Mountain Avenue. When the water subsided, the family builders promptly raised the houses above the high water mark. The flood of '04 was the 13th of dozens of such floods in Winnipeg, and it's noteworthy that the Premier of Manitoba at the time was Redmond Palin Roblin. 5 decades later, his son, commonly known as Duff Roblin, would build a diversionary channel affectionately known as Duff's Ditch to avoid future floods. Unlike their relatives, who would leave Winnipeg for homesteads farther west, Franz and his brother Lawrence remained in the Winnipeg area until 1919, taking construction contracts to build houses and barns north of the city. In 1910, Franz moved his family to a small farm in Eamesville near Pipeline Road, which is now part of Kildonan, a suburb of Winnipeg. Pipeline Road was named for the water pipeline that fed the city from Shoal Lake, and along its 150-kilometer length, Franz and Lawrence constructed sheds designed for maintaining the system. From their small farm or acreage, Franz and Agatha sold milk, chickens, and produce to the largely Jewish community in North Winnipeg. So far in this series, I've not mentioned that Franz, Ferdinand, and many of our relatives were musicians and had their own bands in some cases, and several accounts note that Ferdinand's band gave performances in Winnipeg. However, the story of music in our family deserves its own video, which will follow in due course. Ferdinand's son and my father's father Maximilian, listed oddly as Maxwell in the 06 census, turned 18 in May of 1905. For a time, he worked at Drury Brewery, there's a name for you, and also at the CPR, helping to build steam locomotives, where his job was shrinking the thin steel rims onto the larger drive wheels of these engines. No, I also did not know that these wheels had tires. Winnipeg was never intended to be a final destination for most of the family. The main prize lay further west, where free land, as the posters promised, was theirs for the taking in the Northwest Territories, until 1905, that is, when it became the new province of Saskatchewan. By 1906, Ferdinand and his family were ready to board the train one more time and take it from bustling Winnipeg to a whistle stop named Cupar, a mere dot on the vast plains of the untouched prairie. Many adventures awaited them, but they're the topic for Part 6, coming soon. Thanks for watching.